Welcome back to Between Two Racks with the Kilo Crew. On today's episode, we're going to discuss a topic that is near and dear to our hearts, periodization. But to keep it fresh, we're going to keep you all on your toes, and we're not only going to talk undulating periodization, we're going to discuss other forms as well. So, I think this is going to be a long one.
Possibly.
Let's kick it. Steph, I'm going to turn this one over for you.
Periodization. So we have to. A lot of people sometimes they mixed program design and periodization. So program design is basically the building of your training session or of your microcycle. So the exercise selections, the parameters like sets, reps, tempo, and rest. But although program design is extremely important, periodization is as important, if not more. But it's hard. Like they're both so important because great periodization with poor program design doesn't work. And the opposite is true too. So how many people can write great programs, but they have no rhyme and reason in their sequencing of training programs, so there's no real results at the end of the day. So periodization, in essence, the purpose of why we periodize training is basically three main things. One, we want to manage fatigue. Okay, so I mean, Zatsiorski talks about it in the fitness fatigue paradigm, where in order to build fitness, you need to train hard. You need a certain amount of volume, an amount of work in order to build an adaptation to fitness. But in order to express fitness, you need to be fresh. So you need a detraining of loads in order to express or manifest the benefits of your training. So it's all about managing fatigue so you can develop and then express.
Yeah, and this works because fatigue dissipates quicker than fitness. So the fitness qualities last for longer than the fatigue lasts.
Exactly. So that's one part. Then you also have the performance aspect. So you're using periodization to push or drive performance of a certain quality. So in order to drive the performance of quality, you need to have the proper sequencing of modalities from one phase to the next in order to peak performance. So that's one aspect. And then finally, you have the application or the specificity to the task of the whole periodization. So if you're training, if you're programming to improve, let's say, sprinting, but you never get to the point where there's zero transfer or carryover to the act that you're trying to train for, well, then there's a fail in your periodization. You did not achieve what the whole purpose of the training was for. So it's three facets. So the specificity, the performance aspect, and the recovery aspect. So with that in mind, we need to understand that at the essence, when strength training started to be a real thing at the turn of the 20th century, well, the periodization at that time was coined standard periodization in the sense that everybody was doing 3x10 and there was nothing about it. But then by 1917, with Olympic sports, Russian Kotov now started talking about terms like general and specific and preparation and on and on and on. So 1917 already we start having terms to talk about periodization in a way. And then 1964, Matveyev now came up with the traditional theory that we know today as the linear model. And then whenever you hear about the general period or preparatory period, the competitive period, the transition period with the GPP and SPP and pre and competitive period and all that comes from Matveyev in 1964. So we're still using these terms. And then it evolved over the years. And Verkhoshansky in the late 70s came up with the conjugate sequencing model, which Isurin and Bondarchuk kind of expanded on
into the block periodization model. So while they have a lot of similarities, it's there is subtle differences, and they have been expanded on over the years. Like what they were in the 80s is no longer exactly how they're carried out now. They've been refined.
Yeah.
And then we have Schmidt-Bleicher that came out with the undulating periodization model.
Yeah, so early 80s, Schmidt-Bleicher from Germany. So he was using what we know as the undulating periodization model. So it was like a step outside of the whole traditional model that we knew at the time. But the thing is, Charles Poliquin is actually the one who first wrote about undulating periodization in 1988. So like Charles truly is the one that promoted the undulating system, but he told me himself that he learned about that from Schmidt-Bleicher. And then also you have Mike Stone that kind of used a form of undulating periodization for like power development, which was about at the same like mid 80s type of thing. So these like three model-ish are basically the core of most of what you see in today's modern periodization.
So we should go and do a somewhat overview of each, pro cons, who it's applicable for.
Yeah. So
we'll start with linear.
Yeah. So linear periodization, to me, that's the most applicable to the novice.
Yeah.
So people with low training age, people starting out, and even if you're looking at a chronological or a timestamp, like this would be like if you start lifting at 12, for example, if you're youth, well, linear would be the best model. I would say from like, if we're looking at Istvan Bali long-term development of athletes, like that 12 to 16-year-old bracket, they will most likely fare far better using the linear model, simply because you have more of a logical sequencing of training qualities, whereas the first quality train will transfer to improvement in the second quality train, and that second quality train will transfer an improvement in the third quality train, and on and on and on. So it's just this very logical sequencing of action that leads to a peak in the actual learning curve.
So just to clarify for people, when you speak linear, you're saying, let's say if you start at 12 reps or even strength endurance, you start there, and then the next phase you're increasing the intensity, decreasing the volume, and then you're just kind of going that way, right?
Yeah.
And that is if we're talking for pure strength, because you can have a linear model that works from strength into a more power speed based model. So most people will be doing it for strength development, and that's sort of where it has its best outcomes. So you're going to go, say you're starting with 12, you're making your next phase be 10 with either the same amount, probably the same amount of sets, then 8 maybe with less sets, 6. So this is great for beginners because it's very, very easy for them to know, all right, they worked up to 12 reps here. We know roughly what their 12 RM is. We know where we can go for 10. Whereas if they're going to try to make a bigger jump, it's very, very hard to know how they're going to respond. It's sort of like how we talked about during the rep schemes podcast, that the descending reps work really well. It's the same on linear periodization, but it's over a longer term, and they're going to get more exposures to each specific quality. So it works really well for beginners. Yeah. Like everyone should start there.
Beginners, I think and mentally it's easier for them to just kind of adapt to, like, it's not a mental like mess up to jump from one.
But then there's this obvious learning curve of load that's much easier with linear, like you guys just said. But it's also understanding that. So let's say you're training an athlete. Ultimately, what you want from your athlete is speed and power.
Yep.
But in order to truly improve speed and power, you need to improve maximal strength, because speed and power will be potentiated by a prior increase in maximal strength. But in order to improve or increase maximal strength, you'll do better if this is preceded by an increase in hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Because the increase in hypertrophy now will allow you to have more muscle contracting, to have more force production through each muscle contraction to allow you to have a higher peak in maximal strength. So that's why, like, now I went backwards, but that's why the linear model is so effective, because typically you start by developing hypertrophy, so work capacity, workload tolerance, you're building the muscle cross-section area, you're building joint, tendon, ligament resiliency, and then you're moving on. So next step.
Like, this is going to be one of the commonalities between all the periodization models we're talking about today, is they will start with a higher volume, hypertrophy biased focus, because it is going to be the platform for force production and further down power production.
Absolutely. So like any periodization model has the exact same essence, which is it goes from general to specific. It goes from simple to complex. It goes from slow to fast. So for example, front squat for maximal strength, right? So a general exercise that we're talking about an athlete, let's say. So it's very general. There's nothing specific about a front squat.
Yeah.
It's a movement that's very well suited for maximal strength development, but it's also a slower movement, right? So now the next step, let's say power clean. Power clean, slightly more complex movement, slightly faster movement. Okay, so we're getting closer to a sporting action.
Yep.
Then acceleration from a start position, like in a sprint.
Yeah.
So now
Hyper specific.
more specific, more complex, faster. Now, like, it's more starting strength development. So that's the premise, that's the purpose of every periodization model. It follows that type of idea.
So linear is a great place for everyone to start, but it obviously has its limitations, and that's why we generally move away from it once people get beyond the novice stage. So one of the big limitations is there's going to be a detrain of previously trained qualities. So if you're doing a long-term linear periodization approach and you start with hypertrophy, and 12 to 16 weeks later you're finishing with a max strength block, by the time you get there, it's most likely you have detrained the hypertrophy quality and you've lost size, which in essence will actually reduce your ability to properly peak in your max strength block. So you have to be very careful once you get through the novice stage that long linear models are going to lead to lesser results.
And that's why you don't really use them, right? With
well,
advanced people.
It's a big reason, but then you also have advanced people. Obviously you can account for this with slightly less aggressive jump in progressions, but if you're just doing a linear progression in intensities, most likely advanced people are going to burn out because they never get to deload that intensity at any stage. Yeah. So it's another...
Yeah, and there's also the fact that with the advance, because so when you're doing linear, so like you spend all that time building hypertrophy, now you're moving on to strength, and now you're spending a ton of time on strength. Now, even if it's been a while that you haven't touched hypertrophy, and you start losing a little bit of that cross-section area, that myofibrillar hypertrophy, you might still potentially improve strength simply because at this point, because you're novice, you're still improving your synchronization and intermuscular coordination. So you're able to improve strength despite losing some cross-sectional area. But as you get more advanced, from intermediate to advanced, now the problem is a lot of that intermuscular coordination, that synchronization skill is you have it, right? So now if you spend too long without touching hypertrophy and you do lose some cross-section area, this will negatively affect your ability to generate force. So at this point, if you spend too much time on max strength, not touching hypertrophy, you're slowly going to reach a point where there's a point of diminishing return. You're losing strength because now you're losing muscle mass. Plus, like Porrick was saying, there's the whole aspect of load management and the fatigue issue. So the more advanced you are, the stronger you are, the more load you're using, the more strain it is for the central nervous system, but the more strain it is for the connective tissue. So at one point, you need to be able to deload from that or unload from that. So
deload is not a word.
Yeah, it's technically not a word, so that you can actually improve.
Porrick, I like what you said when you brought it back to what we were saying in the rep schemes episode, where it's like sometimes it's just safer to stay with the more standard.
Oh, yeah.
And this is kind of a question. So we always refer to, like, as you're talking about, as the lifter becomes more intermediate or advanced, you can move away from linear towards undulating periodization, whatever it might be. But I do find that a lot of personal trainers have clients that they might be training for a while, but their training age never really advances. Like even with new to weight training, but even like an older population, or even people that have clients that are constantly going on vacation. So they're never truly training consistently enough to earn another form of periodization. So in that instance, is it still something where they could stay with linear because they're not advancing?
They probably
in
could.
Their training age?
It would be down to the specific client. If their goal was to someday be more consistent and reach higher heights, yes, it would make sense. If their goal is
like fitness training to
get something I would probably still move them to an undulating model, because they're going to have more times of training different qualities, which will just be a better overall training stimulus for them, but they're never going to reach the same heights.
I've done this with a few clients where, like, 3-4 weeks I'll do 12 reps, and then 10, 8, 6, and then 6 is typically where I stop with a lot of like gen pop people, and then either I go to undulating or I just start over and I go 12, 10, 8, 6. So again, it just depends on the person, and you can.
But that's the thing that's important to understand. Like the novice, intermediate, advanced, it's a continuum.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, the novice should use more of that model. The advanced should use more of that model. But it's not just chronological. So you can't just be like, okay, you've been training for a year, you're novice, so you do linear. You've been training for 5 years, you're advanced, so you do like conjugate sequencing. Like it really depends. So like you were saying, if your client is on vacation all the time, he's very inconsistent, he only trains 2 times a week, for example, well, he might technically be a novice for 3-4 years, and that client might benefit more from linear periodization throughout. Or even like if he's super inconsistent, it might also kind of be like standard periodization, kind of like the way we approach the novice fat loss and the online fat loss course. Because there's too much inconsistency to even think about periodized programming.
I think that's an important point, and it goes back to always saying, yes, what we teach is undulating, and yes, what you'll see us talk about the most is that, but we do understand, and it takes the coach to understand, realizing that it's not always the answer. It really is dependent on what your clients.
And it's also understanding, because right now I'm speaking directly to our viewers, it's important to understand that all these periodization model comes from the world of sports training.
Yeah.
So we're talking about athletes that have a competitive period.
You're talking about the history of these periodization models come from?
Yeah, every periodization model that exists stems from the world of sports, where they have a competitive period and a non-competitive period. and then they're training and you're managing training to peak for a specific event. But when we're talking to personal trainers, where we're training gent pop on a day-to-day for a 1 year period, like continuously for years and years and years, then we have to be a little bit careful too, because certain model, if you stretch for too long, are going to be detrimental to recovery. So that's why even sometimes with that gent pop that you're training all the time, even if you've been training him forever and he is advanced, well, conjugate sequencing, although it is an advanced model, might not be the best idea for that client because he's training all the time. Yeah. So that's why, to me, at Kilo, we teach the undulating model the most, because in my opinion, once you reach a certain point of skill, so like the intermediate lifter, this is the model that you'll be able to handle for the majority of the time, training in a continuous fashion. So that's a huge difference too. That's where people, like we talk about it all the time in our courses, context is everything. So you might love block periodization from Isurin, but it might not mean that it's fully applicable to your client that trains 3 times a week, 52 weeks a year with you all the time.
Yeah. But as an overview, so linear periodization is best used for novices, so 13, and this is based on serious trainees. So 13 to 16-year-old novice, build that base, get them to a level of strength and hypertrophy that they are warranted moving on to something more complex. Or if it's a novice trainee starting later in life, you could do it from anywhere from 3 months to a year, depending on how quickly they adapt to it. If they're a really good responder, after 3 months, they might be good to move on. If they're a slow responder, it could take a full year. So that's always the way I look at linear. Like, there's no set rules to how long you can do something for, but that's a good overview as long as they're serious. If they're not serious and they miss all the time, it could be much longer than that.
Yeah. And then so let's say we keep on going with the long-term athlete development. So I say the word athlete. So we're talking about, like, let's say you're a coach. You start with the kid at 12 and you're training him to peak for athletic performance by the time he's 20, let's say. So now that 12 to 16 would be that linear periodization model. Now 16 to 20-ish, depending on. Yeah. So this is where, in my opinion, the non-traditional, like the undulating, would be the best option. And then once you get to 19, 20 years of age plus, if you are specializing in a elite sport, then I think it's important at that point to consider the conjugate sequencing to really drive.
When you say elite sport at that age, are you even saying these younger athletes, college sports?
No, I'm talking about, like, to be honest, I'm beyond college sports. Okay. I'm talking about, like, most Olympic sports like track and field and throwers or bobsled or speed skating or whatever.
When this becomes their career, almost.
Yeah, but even beyond that, in terms of, we always say team sport athletes are always generalists in the gym, so they might never get there. Yeah. Whereas the track and field and Olympic sport athletes are way more specialized in the gym, so that they can. That's
when they can use these.
Because the problem with that model, as great as it is, like the conjugate sequencing, like Verkhoshansky, Bondarchuk, and Isurin, is they're models developed from track and field. Okay, so we know that a top level sprinter has an incredibly efficient nervous system, has incredibly stiff tendons, has unbelievable resiliency and eccentric strength. We know that most of these throwers are extremely strong, extremely powerful. They have explosive strength like crazy. And the reason why they have that is because their preparatory period is so long. And it's important to understand that the longer the general preparation, the higher the peak. And the more time you spend building a quality, the longer it takes to lose said quality. But so it works really well for these types of sports because the competitive period is so short.
Yeah.
But with team sports, because they have such a long competitive period, the off season is so short that it's hard for them to reach the level of strength training efficiency to warrant the need of conjugate sequencing periodization, in my opinion. You're always going to have the few examples, of course. That's why it's important to know about these models.
And then the more simplistic the sport, and I'm not saying any of these sports are simple, but they are a movement pattern or
not a contact sport.
They're not a contact, chaotic team sport environment, so they can afford to dictate more or dedicate more time to the gym. Whereas if you need to go out and learn 150 plays every week and
practice reps,
and even when you're in the gym, you need to take into account for the chaotic nature of a sport. So there's more change of direction, there's more chance of contact. You'll never reach the same peak levels of specificity as these like individual track sports will.
Yeah. But so since we're talking about like conjugate sequencing, which by the way, conjugate means like
what does a week of conjugate training look like for people who don't?
That could be a lot.
Yeah, but I mean, Porrick will talk about this, but just because conjugate sequencing, it sounds bizarre, but conjugate sequencing means like alternating in a sequence certain blocks or certain quality. Okay, so.
Yeah. So Verkhoshansky in the late 70s was experimenting with concentrated loading. So where this is he's going to pretty much do an overreaching block to see if that improves the quality. So he did a concentrating loading on what he describes as barbell movements. So it's heavy strength work. And through this experiment, all he's seen was everyone getting weaker. Everyone getting weaker. Normally, in Eastern Bloc countries, that experiment would have been ended, but he had been allowed to keep going with it for a little longer. But one of the participants, a female within the study group, got pregnant, had to drop out. He just said, I still want to monitor, see how you're doing, how you're recovering, where your strength level is. So she dropped out, and after a few weeks, he noticed her strength levels were going up significantly. So he did the exact same with everyone else in the group, changed the quality that they're going to train, and found that their strength levels went up past baseline by 30%. So he's like, okay, there's something to concentrated loading. So from there, he's like, okay, what can we do to maximize the training effect of what in turn became blocks? Yeah. So where block periodization came from. So what we're going to do to maximize the training effect of a block, and then how can we sequence that, so the conjugate sequencing, to get the best end result possible. So that's how he came across concentrated loading and how he knew it had the possibility to have better outcomes. So the conjugate sequencing and block periodization, so there's many forms, but the most current one, so the one that's still lasting, is multi-directional block periodization. It's pretty much the same as the conjugate sequencing. And it is, you are training multiple qualities at the same time, but it is the volume you're dictating or dedicating to each quality is going to be the emphasis. So very, very, very broad example. Say your end goal is speed and power. So the most important elements of speed and power is maximum force production, maximum power production, maximum velocity. So all three of these are going to be trained all the time. But block one, we're going to concentrate load on maximum force production because that is the most underlying quality for the expression of the next two qualities. So say 80% of your block volume is dedicated to maximum strength to improve maximum force production. 15% is to power, 5% is speed. So that you're really, really hammering the core element of that block, and the other two are just at maintenance, just there, just enough that you don't detrain. Then you move on to the next block, and depending on the athlete, obviously it's going to change where the percentages go, but say then power goes and it's 50%. With that power, you'd 25% maximum strength, 25% speed. And then you transition to the last block and you have 50% speed, 30% power, 20% maximum strength. So throughout, you're moving more and more specific. You're sequentially building on previously built qualities in a way that's going to help peak. You're sequentially reducing overall volume to reduce fatigue so you can express fitness better. So it's complicated, but it works very well. But everyone has to know all their qualities. They generally have to have a lot of training time, which is one of the big...
How long when you're saying a block, how long is a block in that
generally
model?
2 to 4 weeks is
Okay.
a general rule, but it can be more. It can't really be less than 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
And then do they do all those qualities within one session, or is it like Monday they do more power and Tuesday they do?
It depends.
It
depends.
Depends on
The more, like, realistically, this is developed around people who are going to be doing multiple training sessions per day.
Yeah.
So that's why this works really well in those elite athletes and doesn't work as well with people who are willing to dedicate 3 to 4 hours a week to train, because there's so much to fit into such a short amount of time.
So is that the Westside does Conjugate, or is that not the same?
So
I mean, Porig will talk about they call it Conjugate, but it's not really.
Because it wouldn't make sense because they have one thing that they need to.
okay, so
Well,
so Westside is a modified, what they describe as a modified Russian conjugate system. And they train 3 systems. They train max effort, repeated effort, dynamic effort. So strength, hypertrophy, speed, somewhat. It's more power than speed, but either way, it's fine.
Yeah.
And each time they train at least 2 qualities, because they'll do their max effort with a repeated effort. They'll do their dynamic effort with a repeated effort. So technically, yes, it is. Our lights flickered. So technically, it is a conjugate, but is not like the conjugate sequential system that was first proposed, because it doesn't really build on previously built qualities, especially
because they do the same thing year round.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So what they do to somewhat make it sequential, and you'd have to be there to really know, because from the outside it looks chaotic and sporadic, but I'm sure there was more of a sequential exercise selection when you're actually in the building. But what they do is they rotate exercises, and as they get the competition, they get the more specific exercises to their event. And everyone has to remember their event was a heavily gear assisted powerlifting event. So like for bench press, a very, very, very specific lift for them would be like a 3-board bench press. So they're just building that tricep lockout strap, because the bench shirt is going to do the rest. So it was somewhat conjugate, that you're training multiple facets within the same program, but it wasn't the overall big picture of the conjugate sequential Russian
It's
system.
like the conjugate component is there, but the sequencing is not really. But it's there in the sense that they vary the exercise selection, building towards more specific.
But it almost goes back to being like a track athlete being so specific, and their sport being that one act that they're doing. Like in a sense, that's what they had. They had the lifts that they were going to do in competition that they were training towards.
Yeah, but yes, but Westside it's not as straightforward as that.
Yeah.
There's more layers to it. But like it's just like the essence of it. It's hard to truly understand why it's a conjugate. That's why they call it Russian modified conjugate sequencing. But yeah, it's conjugate in the sense that they're working on these three qualities all the time.
Yeah. It's a hard one, but like it obviously worked very well in that environment, but it's nearly the semantics over the naming. Mm-hmm. So that there's if it would just went by a different name, it wouldn't be as confusing. Yeah. But yeah, it's just semantics.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to another.
Well, and then we have like there's the undulating periodization model. So the one that we tend to use the most. So why the undulating model is so good is simply because it's kind of linear, it's kind of block, but there's just more variation. So that's the thing with all of these systems. What you need to understand is the more advanced you are in training, the more you can afford to have variations in the components of your training and still have results. And the more novice you are, the least drastic changes you should have in your periodization models. So the undulating model is, instead of doing a prolonged introductory phase where, let's say, we're focusing on hypertrophy and then moving on to max strength and then losing some of that hypertrophy because you've been in the max strength for so long and you've went away from hypertrophy, we're kind of like touching to hypertrophy, then moving to strength. Right before we start losing hypertrophy, we're going back to hypertrophy. Right where we're about to lose strength, we're coming back to strength, and on and on and on. So you're undulating throughout different qualities, leading to your end game, to your peak. So it's linear in that sense that we're still starting at the general, going towards the specific, but along that path, you're undulating your intensity and volume. So your volume load is undulating leading up to that peak. So that's why we like it with a lot of trainees, because it allows you to better manage fatigue while making sure that as you're moving forward through time, it's more of a one step back to go two steps forward type of approach. But where it gets confusing with undulating periodization sometimes is you have the classic approach. So the one that was proposed by Charles Poliquin, where it's undulating periodization through the phases, so through the mesocycle. So one mesocycle, so in our case, 3 weeks on hypertrophy, then 3 weeks on maximal strength, then 3 weeks on hypertrophy. So that's the classic approach. But then you have a more advanced version of undulating periodization, which I use with a select number of my clients that are more advanced. So again, like I was saying earlier, the thing about training Gen Pop, and by Gen Pop, I just want you guys to understand that I'm talking about anybody that's training seriously, but that's not an athlete.
We're all Gen Pop.
Yeah, I'm Gen Pop, you're Gen Pop. We're all Gen Pop because we train year round and we're not peaking for a sport. So if I'm training people like Porik, I always use him as an example. So Porik, you could increase the complexity of undulating periodization by using an undulation model that's a weekly undulation, which means that your mesocycle can still be a hypertrophy dominant block for 3 weeks, but then week 1 is, let's say, 12 reps. Week 2 is, let's say, 10 reps. Week 3 is 8 reps. Okay, so there's undulation of intensity and volume within the mesocycle, and that mesocycle will undulate with the other mesocycle as well. So it's a phase-by-phase undulation that comprises weekly undulation of intensity and volume. Okay? And then you have an even more advanced version that I'll use a little bit more with athletes, like in season or closer to the season, which is daily undulating periodization, where now, depending on the goal, because that's the thing, the daily undulating can be purely on a strength quality, meaning that you have 1 day of maximal strength, 1 day of power, 1 day of hypertrophy, or the daily undulating periodization, which I use more, has more to do with the velocities. So your phase could be 5 reps. The phase is 5 reps. But you have 1 day, you're doing 5 reps heavy, like maximal strength, 85% of 1 RM. Then the other day, you're doing 5 reps again, but now fast. We're focusing on power output. So the load is lighter, the velocity is faster. It's still 5 reps, but it's a different modality of training that's more velocity based than like strength quality based. Well, I mean, they're different strength quality, but the main factor is we're looking at the velocity instead of just purely looking at the load per se. But of course, in order to be faster, you need to reduce the load, but that's not really what I'm looking at, looking more at the velocity. So that too is a form of undulating periodization, but it's daily undulation within a mesocycle, and then that mesocycle can be undulating with the next mesocycle. So undulating periodization is extremely layered. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But so is linear, though, because if you look at linear periodization, within certain linear periodization model, each block, because it's still blocks, it's just not, don't think of it as Isern's block periodization, but they're a block of concentrated effort on a certain quality. Even within that block, you could still have like heavy, light days, like heavy, medium, light, heavy, medium, light, that are undulation of intensity within the confines of your linear periodization. So it gets very complicated.
Yeah.
But it's just a question of understanding it. But again, like to me, the easiest way to think about it simply is the more advanced you are, the more you can afford fluctuations and variations. But don't be delusional about who is advanced and who is not. As long as you're progressing with a model and you're progressing substantially, it probably means that you can still stick to that model. Yeah. Okay. But again, it's a little bit more clear cut, in my opinion, between traditional linear and non-traditional undulation as to where you should jump ship, as opposed to when it is, you should be like, okay, I'm doing like Russian conjugate sequencing because this is way more
advanced.
Way more advanced.
It's way more time consuming, way more
demanding.
Yeah.
Because you really have to know your numbers if you're going to do that.
The blocks are way more saturated, so there's way more recovery demands.
Yeah, because the conjugate sequencing is all about the optimizing the delayed transformation and the residual effects.
Yeah, so that's one thing we should bring up. So the two big underlying components that all these models are built off is training residuals and transmutation time, or delayed
transformation.
Delayed transformation. So training residuals is how long a training quality will stay around after you have trained it. So a general rule is the longer it takes to build one of these qualities, the longer the training residuals will be. So hypertrophy takes a long time to build, and it'll take a long time for it to dissipate. Yeah. Yes. Strength takes a medium time to build, medium time to dissipate. Speed can build really fast, dissipate really fast. Yeah. So all the sequencing of these models have to take that into account if we're going to try and maximize the end result. The transformation is how long it takes for a training quality to occur or to come to its full effect. So like a really good example is eccentric training. So once you do eccentric training, it takes 6 to 8 weeks to get the full benefit of that eccentric training block. So having an eccentric training phase right before you need to peak is going to do nothing for anyone. It's only going to make recovery worse and make your results worse. So it has to be sequenced at an appropriate time point within the periodization before there's any benefit. So it's all these models, if done right, take these two things into account.
And if done right is really important, because in order to truly have delayed transformation or transmutation effect, you need to deserve it. Like you need to get to a point of overreaching.
Yep.
So to just touch a certain quality, but after every session you feel fresh. I mean, you're not going to get that delayed transformation because there's nothing to delay from, because you didn't push enough. But if you push enough,
yeah.
I mean,
so no reps in the tank on that one.
but it's not just that. It's more a reflection of the entirety of the program session.
Yeah.
So like, because it's not just intensity, it's also volume. So you need to have a certain volume threshold in order to create the adaptation that you want. But I'll give you a great example, and I love that story. Like Andre, right? Like he used to always tell us that story when Charles was training him in the 80s in preparation for the Olympics. Like Charles would be training like the 6 luge guy, or I forget how many guys they were, and he would get to the gym one day, and he saw the 6 guys sitting on a bench. And he's looking at Andre and 2 or 3 other guys, and he's watching their hands, and their hands are shaking. Like their nervous system was like just hammered. It was just shot, right? And it was right before a session. And then there was 2 guys that they seemed super chill. And Andre was telling me that Charles told these 2 guys to get out. Get out. You don't deserve to train today. It means you didn't push enough prior to, so you don't deserve to be here. But the reason why Charles was looking for the shaky hands was he was trying to get to a certain point, a point of not overtraining, but a point of overreaching, which showed that you've trained hard and intensely enough to allow yourself to move away from that quality. And now you move on to something else after. And then because of that, then you will have a delayed transformation, which means that your peak potential of that skill you spent time training will be much higher than it would have been if you just like chilled through that section. He was playing with the mindset part of things. Like he was like, hey, now you don't deserve to do that workout. Now you better think twice. If you want to be part of that team, you better think twice and not half-ass yourself. So in the future, these kids are going to push a little bit more because they want to be part of the team. So I think that physiologically speaking, maybe it was not the right thing, but on a mental perspective, it's very old school, but I think it's a good approach. You know?
But so even when we come back to the way we do the undulating, we even bring in more of the block elements the more advanced someone gets, because each phase we go into saturates the quality to a greater extent the more advanced someone gets. So like if the students will notice, like when we're introducing eccentrics, the novice gets a little touch, but if you're advanced, you get hammered. Yeah. So it's even within different periodization models, you can still somewhat steal from the others, depending on as long as it makes sense in the case of the full model. But the saturation component is what's going to force the adaptation to warrant moving away from training that quality.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And like I want to clarify this so for you guys to really understand what we're talking about, because the whole saturation thing, it's a little complicated, because like that conjugate sequencing, we're talking about athletes that have like technical, tactical, speed, jump, whatever, right? On top of the training. But when Kilo Strength Society is talking about training, we're talking about strength training as our only task that we do for life. That's all we do. Strength train. I walk and strength train. Okay? Walking doesn't count. So we strength train. But we're not doing conjugate sequencing, because if we were truly purely doing conjugate sequencing within our blocks, so our mesocycles, it would mean, okay, that a typical kilo workout would be A series squat 6x3, B series front squat 6x3, and then you're done, right?
Yeah.
But no, our training session, we're focusing on a certain element that we're trying to develop that stems from the primary multi-joint compound movements. That's why our entire system is based off of that A series, because the A series is ultimately the thing. These 8 primary movements, the primate, is what we're trying to improve. You have to look at it as these 8 lifts is our event, okay? Yeah. And then the B series and C series, the assistance and remedial stuff, they're only there in order to improve somehow the performance of these A series movements. So our assistance work will either touch hypertrophy or functional hypertrophy, or sometimes strength endurance, simply to add some component to the phase we're in. And then the remedial stuff works on very targeted muscle that are more like prevention or rehab, or targeted muscles that somehow are limiting factors to help into the development of the primary movement. So that's why you can't really look at what's going on in the B and C series, because these are basically separate entities to help promote the performance of the primary. So it's almost like, on a periodization standpoint, the focus needs to be on the primary. So in that sense, if you're just looking at the primary, it might look like conjugate sequencing, because for an entire meso, we're working on max strength on that lift. But it's not, because we're still working on hypertrophy or strength endurance with the assistance and remedial work. But it's more on a
complementary basis.
Complementary. It's not as much. It's not interfering as much with what we're trying to accomplish with the A series. But that's why it gets a little confusing, because because when we're talking about, like, okay, this is a hypertrophy mesocycle. Well, it's mostly what we're doing in the A series that we're really looking at. But then, like Porrick was saying, though, the more advanced you become and the more saturation you need in order to create a training response. Now, at that point, to just do like eccentrics on one movement in the entire training session might not be enough saturation to elicit the response we're looking for. So that's why at that level, you're going to have a eccentric in your A series and another eccentric in the B series. It's just that the B series eccentric will typically be a less advanced form of eccentric loading, but at least we're truly trying to saturate eccentrics for that time frame, so that we can truly get an overreaching response with eccentric loading. So that and then we typically do eccentric phases within intensification 1, which is week 4, 5, and 6, so that we can have that delayed transformation by week 12 to finally peak our primary lift to its highest potential.
And that's if we're trying to peak a specific lift. If we're not trying to peak a specific lift, you could have eccentrics every A series and every B series across a week, and we're just trying to saturate the hell out of the quality to elicit that response for maybe a hypertrophy effect. So it can be pretty intensive depending on the situation that you're in.
We'll leave that to you.
Going back to what you were saying, Steph, in terms of for the majority of personal trainers working with our clients, we're all Gen Pop. We train to strength train, and we want longevity in our strength training. We're going to keep doing it for long. You want to keep your clients for a long time. I think it's kind of ties into, and this was a discussion we kept going back and forth on when we were deciding what our level 1 certification was. So our level 1 certification, you need the program design course, you need the periodization course, and you need the optimizing strength ratios course. But the optimizing strength ratios course goes back to what you're saying, where you're just focusing on optimizing the primary lifts in the A series. But this course, for a lot of like personal trainers, they're like, I'll never need that. But this is how we view strength training. Your strength training, long term, you do want some type of goal, not just to constantly change. We always talk about getting clients and they're like, oh, I want strength, but now I want fat loss. Oh, now I want hypertrophy. Now I want power. Like if your plan is to stick to strength training for a long period of time, that's when optimizing strength ratios come into play.
Yeah, I mean, like the way I like to look at optimizing strength ratio and why it's part of our foundational curriculum is you need to take the information, this course, with a grain of salt, in the sense that we're not saying that a perfect strength ratio amongst all primary lift means that you will be the highest performing, least injured human on earth. But there are trends. So typically, if you achieve proper strength ratio across these 8 lifts, you're more likely to perform at a higher level, and you're less likely to develop overuse type injuries because you have better muscular balance across all movement patterns. And then the problem with most people, most coaches, when they deal with long-term client, because it's easy to program for 12 weeks when you have a very specific task. But when you're training for life all the time, at one point, you don't really know what to choose exercise-wise. So people end up just picking exercise at random. Oh, we'll do front squats here because, we haven't done front squat in a while. Let's do front squats today. Ooh, we haven't done dips in a year and a half. Let's do dips. But there's no rhyme or reason for it. But at least if you're looking at strength ratios and you realize that this specific client, his front squat is much weaker than what it should be, at least now it gives you a short-term goal to focus on. Well, you know what? The next macro, the next 12 weeks, let's focus on bringing up that front squat to maximize our ratio, so maximize the muscular balance of our client, because it's just going to improve performance and it will reduce the likelihood of injuries. We might not hit the perfect ratio, but at least it's a trend towards better balance. So why not? Instead of picking a lower body exercise at random, now we have an actual reason to pick a specific exercise, and then depending on what the limiting lift is for that lower body or that upper body movement, then we have a very specific microcycle structure that will optimize not only the performance but the recovery in order to peak and realize the action, which are the 3 factors of periodization.
Yeah.
Mic drop.
Yeah, but because obviously if you did a hyper specialized specific lift program, like someone wants to bring up their bench press and they're benching 2 to 3 times a week, will they hit a higher number at the end of that? Maybe, but it's the training for life element that you always have to come back to, because if they just want to, like if they say they're going to do a powerlifting competition and they're doing it in 6 months' time, if they spent the first 3 months bringing up their limit and lift, so they're going to get their strength ratios way closer and then specialize in the bench press, they're going to be way better off. Whereas if they just said, I'm 6 months out from a powerlifting meet, I'm going to specialize now, all right, you maybe get one of those. Yeah, next year mightn't go so well.
Yeah, and that's why you see so much pattern overload type injuries with powerlifters, because they stick to very specific actions all the time. But what Porrick is saying is so true. So let's say that you want to improve your bench press. You want to peak your bench press for like in 6 months.
Yep.
Okay. But you want to do it in the optimal fashion, and you want to make sure that you're reducing the incidence of injury. Well, I know for a fact, 99.9% of the time, the lowest hanging fruit in terms of upper body pushing exercises where almost everybody's weaker than what they should be is the overhead press. So to me, I would start my first macro with a overhead press dedicated macro to drive the strength of the overhead press, because we know that a human being with a very strong overhead press will also have a very strong bench press.
Yep.
So why not focus on the overhead, bringing up the strength of the biggest limiting factor, and then you've driven up the overhead press. Now the next macro cycle, you focus on the bench press, but at least you don't have that lag.
Yeah.
And it's like we were talking about a block potentiating the next block. Well, that's exactly what it is, what it does, but on the lift perspective instead of any strength quality perspective.
And the perfect example of that is strongmen. Like,
Yep.
strongmen are strong as hell overhead. They never bench press. They get 12 weeks of bench press and they're strong as shit in the bench press too. But it's funny enough because they're strong as hell overhead.
Yeah. So, and the thing, and also what's interesting with the optimizing strength ratio is you learn within undulating periodization the proper sequencing of phases in order to peak a limiting lift. Because if you're training for hypertrophy, the timing of training methods will be different than if you're peaking for max strength on a lift or if you're peaking for speed strength, for example. So it's important to know the goal of the macro cycle in order to, one, dictate the intensity, dictate the volume, but also dictate the sequencing of training method to peak whatever is the final objective of that macro cycle. So all of these elements are so important. And to go back to what you were talking earlier about training for life, that's where we have our long-term periodization model as part of our databases, because now if you're training for life and you have a quadrennial cycle approach to periodization using undulating periodization, now each macro cycle will undulate through time, but it will follow the strength continuum where, you know, your first macro cycle of year one will most likely, well, not most likely, will be in any model hypertrophy, because the hypertrophy is the base of everything. And then it undulates and it moves forward. The intensities undulates. So then, I said it in the previous podcast, but if you let the intensities of the undulating macros over the course of time tell you what to do in terms of quality to train, then you know that your strength potential at the end of the day will be much higher, because you follow the proper continuum and a proper sequencing of qualities in order to peak the highest level of strength and performance. So that's why this approach is so important with your Gen Pop client training for life, which is very different than sports. Context, I'm repeating myself, but context is really important. Don't necessarily blindly follow the favorite periodization model of your favorite team or sports strength coach when you don't have the clientele to use that model with.
Yeah. So that's a big part for the block and the conjugate sequencing. Both those models are very much dictated around a very specific peak. Very specific peak. So you have an end goal,
Specific day
for a reason,
Yeah.
whereas undulating, you can peak. There's no doubt you can peak, but you can also just train it for life without going through a complete tapering realization phase to 100% display your maximum level of strength. So whereas the other ones are very much designed to have you at the peak of fitness for a maximum display of whatever the quality you need to be.
Yeah. And then again, it's so confusing because every parts of every model kind of fits into any model.
Yep.
But another periodization model that we like at Kilo, I really like it, I've been playing with it for a long time, is the wave periodization model, which is a form of undulating periodization, but at the same time, it's also a form of conjugate sequencing in a way. Okay, but the way it works is basically you take the weekly undulating model, but you take that weekly model and you throw it onto a phase.
Yep.
You throw it onto a mesocycle. So it's like the microcycle becomes a mesocycle. Okay. So for example, that's why with the wave periodization, we love to use the 14-day microcycle, because then it becomes a weekly undulating periodization model. Mm-hmm. But now the way it looks on a bigger picture is wave. So for example, if we're using the 14-day micro, so we have week 1, overhead, squat 1, bench, front squat. Week 2, incline, squat 2, dip, deadlift. Okay, so this is our entire microcycle, but it's 14 days, it's 2 weeks. So that microcycle can become a mesocycle, where now these 2 weeks, let's say we're doing 10 reps. Then week 3 and 4, we're repeating that microcycle. So overhead, squat 1, blah, 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 it repeats. But now, that week 3 to 4, we're doing 8 reps. Okay. Now, week 5 and 6, now we're repeating that microcycle again. Overhead, squat 1, blah, blah, blah. But now we're doing 6 reps. Okay. So now, over a 6-week period, we've done 10, 8, and 6. Okay. So it went linear.
Yep.
Okay. But now I'm going to show you guys that it will undulate, but it will undulate in a wave fashion. So that was block 1. Okay. So 6 weeks, block 1, 10, 8, 6. Okay. And we repeated the exact same microcycle every 14 days. Now we're entering block 2, week 7, going back to overhead, squat 1, etc., etc. But now we're doing 9 reps. Then week 9 and 10, we're doing 7 reps. And then week 11 and 12, we're doing 5 reps. Okay. So this is wave periodization, which is a form of linear / undulating. Yeah. But it's cool because now over the course of our 4, so let's say that you are training for life. Let's say that your radar graph of strength ratios is on point. Why not use a 14-day microcycle? Because now you're touching everything all the time. So you can slowly drive up everything in a sustainable manner, but you're using that wave. So you're progressing to a higher peak of intensity as you're reducing volume. And then after 6 weeks, to make sure you're not losing the metabolic end of your continuum, you go back to it, but slightly more intense. So instead of 10, we're doing 9. And then we're going 9 to 7 to 5. So then over the course of that 12-week period, our lowest intensity was 74% with 10 reps, and our highest intensity was 85% at 5 reps. So we've trained across a 11% range for 12 weeks. But we waved it so that we monitored fatigue, but because we use a slower approach, we coaxed ourselves towards higher intensities instead of those more drastic variations from phase-based undulating periodization. It leads to just a more sustainable increase in strength.
Yeah, and then, like we were playing about with the volumes, so you can do different breakdowns of volumes from phase to phase to phase and block to block to have different outcomes. So you can do it to emphasize hypertrophy or strength or power, and then you can play about with the sequencing of training methods between eccentric and isometric and power-based stuff to have different outcomes as well. And that's where Tsunami Swole
That's
came
what I
in.
was going to say. This is what Tsunami Swole macro cycle is.
So Tsunami Swole follows this with the intention of electing hypertrophy, but like very much on a strength basis hypertrophy. There's no bodybuilding methods. But yeah, so the sequencing of intensities, volume, and training methods have all been designed to maximize the hypertrophy response.
With the 14-day microcycle.
With the 14-day micro. Yep. So it's a fun one. And then the first block, the methods used are slightly less intensive than the ones used in the second block, so that builds on itself.
Yeah.
So there's a lot.
Like on the, for example, you could use this for power development, like for speed strength development, where you could legit have week 1 and 2 max strength, week 3 and 4 explosive strength, and then week 5 and 6 starting strength, and then week 7 and 8 max strength again. So you're retouching max strength. Then you're moving on to explosive strength, but a faster mode of explosive strength. So let's say ballistic, heavy ballistic type stuff. And then the last phase, you're doing reactive strength. So now it's cool because we're following the speed strength continuum, but we're still touching at every element that is important in the expression of speed strength.
I should try that for one of the power blocks. That'd be a fun one.
Oh yeah, it's great. You're gonna love it. Plus, what's cool about it too, on the psychological perspective, is that you're constantly subjecting yourself to new stuff. So the whole boredom component. Not only are you pushing away the boredom issues in the sense that every 2 weeks the training modality and the quality changes, but on top of it, every session the movement changes.
Yep.
So it's really cool. But again, because there's so much variability and variations, you need to be at a certain level of training age.
Yep.
Like you'll benefit from it.
Yeah.
But the full-blown novice, that would be too much variation.
And if someone expects to peak a very specific movement, they're probably not going to, because there's not going to be an awful lot of rehearsal. But as building overall strength qualities, it'll be very beneficial because you'll be doing it on lots of different modalities. So if you're doing it to peak a vertical jump, you could probably have to be a little more specific. But if you just want to be overall a better display of power and speed, it'd be a great method to do it.
Yeah, and then for those of you who are looking to like a training, like let's say the power and speed or the athletic component is not that big of a deal. Well, just that standard undulating, the wave loading, but with using more like hypertrophy and max strength protocol will go a long way in the long run for the expression of jackness. I like to use that term.
Coining it.
Because so so I'm gonna be 47 like soon, right? But listen, like, am I ever going to compete? Am I ever going to be a running back?
No.
No.
There's still hope.
I still want to be able to move and stuff, but what I really want is I want to find jackness again. But to find jackness, it's the perfect bridge between hypertrophy and strength. Yep. So I don't want to just train hypertrophy because one, it's boring, and two, it gets old and like you're just beat up from just hypertrophy because it's so volume dependent. And then on the flip side, I don't want to be a power lifter. I don't want to just train heavy. I don't want my joints to blow out. But by using the wave, you're basically you're going across the continuum in a smooth manner, but a progressive manner. So over time, you can express more size and express more strength, so you can reveal your jackness to the public.
One other thing about wave, and this would be more advanced again, but using complex rep schemes. So since if you're going to do it, you're going to be exposed to a complex rep scheme for 6 weeks. So it's going to suck.
Yeah, beat up.
So like say you're doing stage descending, it would be 10, 8, 6 for your first wave. Then you'd be going 8, 6, 4 for your second wave, and then 4, 6, or 6, 4, 2 for your third. So as an overall intensity, you went from 8 to 6 to 4. So you're still waving, but you're doing it in a complex rep scheme. But
yeah. So in total, you've went across a huge range.
Yeah, but you're going to be beat up doing complex rep schemes for 6 weeks. So you
Yeah.
better be prepared for that.
And you better make sure you have a good active recovery week plan for you.
Yeah.
Peri-workout nutrition.
So if you're going to do wave loading, definitely start with standard sets.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I think it goes back to, again, what we're always saying. It seems to come up on every episode. Yes, we're talking about advanced things, but just because we get all excited about it and you got excited listening to it doesn't mean you take it and you immediately apply it.
Start with the basics.
Yeah, but exactly. But like, it's like everything in life. If you want to get good at something, at one point you need to learn the complex.
Yeah.
Because if we're just catering to the intro gen pop, I'm like, there's
No, and our goal is
Our
to
education
still get
would last
everyone
1 hour.
to get to that point. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So if you really enjoyed this episode, I highly recommend joining us for the comprehensive periodization seminar, August 17th. We're a month away now. We'll be traveling to Amsterdam, August 17th, and then Lyon, France on August 24th. That course will be taught in French.
En français.
Oui.
We,
Salut.
oh, this is a new one.
Anything else on periodization to wrap this one up?
I mean, it's such a fun topic. To me, like program design, periodization, that's our thing. It's our favorite thing. So read up on it, learn on it, apply it, gather the information. Okay, don't just do it and be like, oh yeah, I think it worked. Like gather data, look at it, test it for yourself. But once you do this, then you realize, like we did, that in the long run, undulating periodization works well for most, which is why we use this. But it doesn't mean that there's not other model. Yeah. You just need to know about them, how to use them, when to use them, and who to use it with. But just understand that these are very specific group of people that you need to employ these systems with.
Yeah, there's a massive art to the program design and periodization part of it, and understanding it. Yeah,
and then like I was going to make a Lloyd Banks reference, but I'll
You'll
stay.
save it.
Yeah.
Okay.
G-Unit.
Thanks for tuning in.